Right now, as you watch this, 4 astronauts are heading to the moon. Their names are Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen. They launched on April 1, 2026, aboard a rocket called the Space Launch System from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Their spacecraft is called Orion. They named it Integrity. On April 6th, they will fly around the far side of the moon, the first human beings to travel that far into deep space in 53 years. Then they will come home. 53 years. The last time anyone went to the moon was December 1972, when Apollo 17 splashed down in the Pacific, and the most extraordinary program of human exploration in history quietly ended. And then, for half a century, nobody went back. Why not? That question has a long answer involving money and politics and shifting national priorities. But there is a shorter answer, and it contains something that most Americans never knew. The reason America stopped going to the moon in 1972 is partly because the race that had driven the country to get there was already over. America had won. The Soviet Union had lost. And the full story of how the Soviets lost, a story involving a secret rocket program, 4 catastrophic explosions, and the death of the one man who might have made it work, was classified by the Soviet government and not made public until 1989. This is that story. And it begins, as so many Cold War stories do, with a beeping sound from orbit. October 4th, 1957. The dinner tables of America are being cleared. Families are settling in for a Friday night. It is a good time to be an American. The economy is booming, the suburbs are growing, and the future seems manageable. And then, somewhere above the atmosphere, crossing over the United States at 17,000 miles per hour, a small metal sphere the size of a beach ball begins to beep. Within hours, ham radio operators have picked up the signal and broadcast it on American radio and television. The sound is mechanical, repetitive, almost banal. But it travels into American living rooms, carrying a message that the beep itself does not contain. The unmistakable message that the Soviet Union has just done something the United States had not done first. The satellite is called Sputnik. It weighs 184 pounds. It has no cameras, no weapons, no military capability of any kind. It is, by the standards of what would come later, extraordinarily primitive. But the rocket that put it there is capable of delivering a nuclear warhead to any point on Earth in less than an hour. The American reaction was what Eisenhower later called a wave of near hysteria. The New York Times mentioned Sputnik in 279 articles in October alone. One Soviet scientist, quoted across American newspapers, said, "Americans design better automobile tail fins, but we design the best intercontinental ballistic missiles and Earth satellites." In December 1957, the American response, the Navy's Vanguard rocket, rolled out to the launch pad with a full complement of media witnesses, rose approximately 4 feet off the ground, sank back, and exploded. The satellite landed in nearby grass and continued transmitting its test signal. The newspapers called it Flopnik. The Soviet delegate to the United Nations offered to include the United States in the Soviet foreign aid program for technologically underdeveloped countries. America was behind, and it knew it. And the question was, who had put them behind? His name was Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, and for the entire duration of the space race, the Western world did not know it. Korolev was born in Ukraine in 1907. He was fascinated by flight from childhood. He studied aeronautical engineering in Moscow, founded one of the Soviet Union's first rocketry organizations in 1931, and by his early 30s was one of the most promising aerospace engineers in the country. And then, in 1938, at the height of Stalin's Great Terror, he was arrested. The charge was sabotage, a charge that required no evidence and offered no defense. A colleague had denounced him under interrogation to reduce his own sentence. Korolev was beaten during questioning, his jaw broken. He was sentenced to 10 years in the labor camps and sent to Kolyma, one of the most brutal facilities in the Gulag system, in the far northeast of Siberia, where the cold alone killed prisoners who had survived everything else. He nearly died there. Scurvy, malnutrition, permanent damage to his health that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He was saved not by justice, but by luck. An aircraft designer named Tupolev, himself a prisoner, requested Korolev's transfer to a prison design bureau, where engineers were kept alive and put to work on state projects. Korolev spent the rest of his sentence designing aircraft in captivity. He was released in 1944. After the war, he was sent to Germany to examine the remnants of the Nazi rocket program, the V-2 missiles that had struck London, built by slave labor, the most advanced rockets ever made. The Americans had gotten there first, taking the best German scientists under Operation Paperclip, including Werner von Braun. Korolev got what was left. He studied it with the intensity of a man who had spent years in a labor camp thinking about exactly these problems. He went home to the Soviet Union and built something better. By the early 1950s, he had produced the R-7, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. On October 4, 1957, it put Sputnik into orbit. And for security reasons, the Soviet government classified his identity. The man who had launched the space age was referred to in all public communications as the chief designer. His name, his face, his history, all state secrets. Even many of the cosmonauts who worked directly with him knew him only by his title. He became the most important aerospace engineer in the world, and the world did not know who he was. After Sputnik, the race accelerated. The Soviet Union put the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin, April 1961. The first spacewalk, the first soft landing on the moon. First, the Soviets built a record that seemed to confirm what Sputnik had suggested, that the communist system, for all its brutality, could organize scientific resources in ways that a democracy could not match. And then President Kennedy made his declaration. Before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. He said it in May 1961. He meant it. And the Americans began, with a seriousness and a scale that the Soviets had not anticipated, to actually try. The Soviet government, which had publicly denied being in a race to the moon at all, secretly approved a crude lunar landing program in August 1964, 3 full years after Kennedy's declaration. The rocket they would need was called the N-1. Korolev was its chief designer. The N-1 was enormous, comparable in size to the American Saturn V that would eventually carry Apollo to the moon. Its first stage had 30 engines, arranged in a circular pattern. This was the fundamental design choice that would eventually destroy the program. The American Saturn V had 5 massive engines in its first stage, individually tested and proven. The Soviet N-1 had 30 smaller engines that were never tested as a complete system before launch, because the Soviet program did not have a test stand large enough. They would learn whether the 30 engines worked together by launching them. In 1964, this seemed like a manageable risk. Then, in January 1966, Sergei Korolev went to the hospital for what should have been routine surgery to remove intestinal polyps. The surgeons discovered a tumor. The surgery became more complex than expected. His jaw, broken during interrogation in 1938 and never properly healed, made intubation difficult. The anesthesiologist could not properly manage his airway. He died on the operating table on January 14, 1966. He was 58 years old. The man who had conceived and built the Soviet space program, who had turned a labor camp prisoner into the architect of the space age, was dead. His deputy, Vasily Mishin, took over. Mishin was technically capable, but lacked Korolev's political connections, his organizational authority, the specific combination of vision and force of personality that had kept the program moving against institutional resistance for a decade. And Mishin, by multiple accounts of people who worked with him, drank heavily. The N1 program continued without Korolev. It was underfunded, understaffed, and running years behind the American program that Korolev had never publicly acknowledged was a competition. Between February 1969 and November 1972, the Soviet Union attempted to launch the N1 4 times. All 4 attempts failed. All 4 failures were catastrophic, and all 4 were kept secret from the rest of the world. The first launch, February 21, 1969, ended when the rocket's engines failed 70 seconds after liftoff, and the vehicle crashed back toward the launch complex. Debris rained across the facility. The second launch, July 3, 1969, was the worst. The N1 lifted off just after midnight. Moments after clearing the pad, it fell back. The explosion was so powerful that pieces of the rocket were thrown 10 kilometers away. Windows shattered in structures 40 kilometers from the launch site. A 400-kilogram fuel tank landed on the roof of a building 7 kilometers away. One of the 2 N1 launch pads was completely destroyed. It would take years to rebuild. The date was July 3, 1969. Apollo 11 was sitting on its launch pad at Kennedy Space Center, 16 days from launch. On the night of the second N1 explosion, the head of the Soviet cosmonaut training program wrote in his private diary, "We are desperate for a success, especially now when the American astronaut Frank Borman is our guest." But all such hopes were dispelled by the powerful explosion. The failure has put us back another 1 or 1.5 years. Frank Borman, the commander of Apollo 8, who had been the first human to orbit the moon 6 months earlier, was in Moscow on a goodwill visit. He was being shown Soviet space facilities. He was not shown the launch site at Baikonur, where one of the 2 N1 pads was still smoldering. The Soviets told him nothing. They told the world nothing. When journalists asked whether the Soviet Union was planning a mission to preempt Apollo 11, Soviet officials neither confirmed nor denied it. The second N1 explosion was classified. The program that had been racing to beat Armstrong to the lunar surface had already lost in the dark at midnight in Kazakhstan, and nobody outside the Soviet space program knew. Apollo 11 landed on the moon on July 20, 1969. Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. The race was over. The Soviet Union continued launching the N1 anyway. The third launch in June 1971 failed when the rocket began rolling uncontrollably seconds after liftoff. The fourth launch in November 1972, the same month Apollo 17 made the last Apollo lunar landing, ended when the first stage engines shut down prematurely and the vehicle fell back toward the pad. The program was quietly terminated in 1974. The remaining N1 hardware, the rockets that had been built and never flown, the components that had been manufactured and never used, was ordered destroyed, cut up and disposed of. The Soviet government wanted no physical evidence of how far the program had come and how completely it had failed. The details of both Soviet lunar programs were classified until 1989, when Glasnost finally allowed them to be published. Today, the Orion spacecraft, carrying Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen, is en route to the Moon. On April 6th, they will fly around its far side, the first humans to travel so far from Earth since 1972. The photograph Commander Wiseman took from Orion's window on day 3 of the mission shows the Earth from a distance that very few human beings have ever seen it. A sphere of blue and white against the black of space. Impossibly beautiful, impossibly small. It is the same view that Korolev spent his entire career trying to make possible. He launched the first satellite. He launched the first human. He designed the rocket that was supposed to take a Soviet cosmonaut to the Moon. He died before any of that happened, and the world did not learn his name until his obituary was published in Pravda. The Artemis II mission is a test flight. Its crew will not land on the Moon. They will fly around it and come home. The landing comes later, Artemis III, currently planned for 2028, when NASA intends to put the first woman and the first person of color on the lunar surface. America is going back to the Moon, and this time there is no Soviet program racing to get there first. That asymmetry, the fact that only one country is seriously attempting crude lunar exploration, is itself a legacy of the Cold War. The Soviet program that might have competed with Artemis died in 1974, when Mishin was fired. The remaining N1 hardware was destroyed, and the Soviet leadership quietly redirected their space resources toward Earth orbit stations. The race that had produced Sputnik and Gagarin and Apollo and the most extraordinary decade of human achievement in history ended not with a peace treaty or a summit, but with a classified order to cut up some rockets in a remote facility in Kazakhstan. Korolev's name became public only in his obituary. The N1 explosions became public only in 1989. The cosmonauts who had trained to land on the Moon, Alexei Leonov, who had been the Soviets' first choice for the first man on the Moon among them, spent the rest of their careers flying to space stations in Earth orbit, orbiting the planet that Korolev had spent his life trying to leave behind. One detail stays with me. When Korolev was finally, formally rehabilitated by the Soviet government in 1957, when they officially acknowledged that his arrest and imprisonment had been unjust, he was already 40 years old. He had spent years in a labor camp for a crime that the government now admitted had never happened. He had a decade and a half of the most productive years of his career ahead of him. He used them to build the rockets that launched the space age, including the one that put Sputnik in orbit on the night the Soviet government acknowledged he had been wrongfully imprisoned. He never complained publicly. He never asked for recognition. He kept working. The work was the thing. The Orion spacecraft is heading to the Moon. In 6 days, its crew will see the far side, which no human eyes have seen since December 1972. They will take photographs. They will come home. And the program that put them there, NASA, created in direct response to Sputnik, funded by the fear and then the pride that Korolev's work had generated, will continue toward a landing. The chief designer would have understood what that meant. Whether he would have recognized it as a victory for the species or a defeat for the country he had served is a question only he could have answered. And he died in 1966, without knowing his name would ever be public. The Moon does not remember who got there first. It just keeps orbiting. Thank you for watching. If you found this story worth your time, subscribe. We cover the Cold War stories that were never supposed to be declassified. one episode at a time. New episode every week. We will be there.